This is one of the topics we'll be talking about tonight. It focuses principally on the symbiotic relationship between art making, workspaces, and the body, principally her own. From 1945 to 49, she studied at the University of Bucharest, and she studied initially literary criticism, and then at the Bucharest Academy of Fine Arts. But in 1950, upon the beginning of the communist government, she was pushed out of that school, and she worked principally as an illustrator and a graphic designer after that, and became the artistic director of the prestigious literary magazine in Romania, Secolul 20, or the 20th century, which is now known appropriately as the 21st century. Her work is included in major public collections, including MoMA, which has only recently acquired her works, but now has holdings. And she was a representative of Romania at this year's Venice Biennale in a show that was much talked about, and also included in Massimiliano Gioni's 2013 Biennale, the Encyclopedic Palace. As I'd said before, the exhibition upstairs on the second floor is the first solo show devoted to her work. And tonight we have with us our panelists. András is a Hungarian art historian living and working in Budapest, but also here in New York, and she's long been affiliated with the Institute of Art History at the Research Center of the Humanities of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, where she's a senior research fellow and holds a PhD in art history. Her academic interests have centered primarily on Eastern and Central European modern and contemporary art, and on gender issues, socially engaged art, critical theory, the post-socialist condition, and more recently, nationalism in the region. She was a core member of the international seminar series Writing Art History in Eastern and Central Europe, which is organized by the Clark Art Institute. And she edited the 2009 anthology Transitland Video Art from Central and Eastern Europe, 89 to 2009. And among her curatorial activities, she was co-curator of the Universal Hospitality exhibition in Vienna in 2016, and the ongoing version of that, which is called Universal Hospitality 2, in Prague. And these are shows that have focused on the increasingly urgent issues surrounding migration and displacement. And finally, as a visiting professor, she recently taught a course at the Central European University in Budapest entitled Artist, and this is relevant for tonight, Artist as an Agent of History, from Symbolic Politics to Visual Activism. And in conversation with her tonight will be Florence Derieux, who recently came to Hauser Wirth as the Director of Exhibitions after 2 years at the Pompidou Center, for the Centre Pompidou's Foundation, as the curator of American art and the curator at large for the museum in Paris. She's a widely respected curator with extensive experience in the museum world, who began her career at the Picasso Museum in Antibes and at the Palais de Tokyo in Paris. Beginning in 2008, she was director for several years of the FRAC, Champagne-Ardenne in Reims, where she organized exhibitions of work for many artists and book projects, including Tom Burr, Cyprien Gaillard, Nick Maus, Lisa Oppenheim, and Sterling Ruby. And finally, between 2013 and 2015, she was a curator of Art Basel Parcours, which is, most of you know, invites artists to conceive projects in historic sites around Basel. So I thought maybe we would start talking tonight, because I know it's one of the subjects that you would like to talk about Geta's focus on the studio as the locus of her work, the meaning of the studio for her, and the fact that so much of her work has, in film and drawing, is about her being in the studio.
So actually for this question, I have to go a little bit back, and I do not know how you are familiar with a socialist private space and public space. So I would like to a little bit speak about it, because I do think that the Western assertion a bit different from the reality. So sometimes the Western assertion was about, especially the socialist time under Ceausescu, that to think the state, which is mobilizing the public space, is totally dominating and totally oppressive. And there is this victimized society, the people. So, and the two imagined as it would be totally separated. So this is one thing which I would like to get back. The other thing is that as public and private understood in Western meaning is that there is the public, which is the communal, which is the common, and there is this particular interest, which is the private. Plus comes the privacy, and this is the most important, which I would like to emphasize. The privacy as something which is secured with rights and secured by the law. So a kind of institutionalized, secured place. So that kind of stuff did not exist.
You're speaking about the West, that's
yes.
the conception of privacy in the West.
Yes, the West conception, yes. So, and this kind of privacy absolutely does not exist. So when sometimes it is written about the studio as escaping to the privacy, but this secured, institutionally secured space did not exist. This is one thing. The other thing, that the Western notion of this division is divided by gender as well. So public space as a masculine space and private space as a female space. And this does not apply either. The thing is that the public space belongs to the state and to the power. And in this meaning, the male artists or intellectuals equally excluded from the public space, not just women. So the division is mostly along the power relations and not along gender. So this is quite important to emphasize. And when I told that what is the imagination, Western imagination about the division between private and private is important for me, because in this conception, the agency of the artist is totally lost. But what could do artists in this situation, that they are deprived of the public space, they are truly in a wider meaning of the word, and at the same time they are not secured in privacy. So they use the studio, and I wouldn't say that the secondary public space sometimes use this notion that Geta used the private space and studio as a secondary public space. I would not say this, because this presupposes some kind of openness, that you can visit it, that you can participate, and this wasn't the case. But I would rather put that it was an imaginary public space. So the studio served as a compensation for the lack of public space, which was not available, or a substitute. So she treated as if it would be an exhibition space, as a stage, and a studio.
And, you know, from reading interviews with her, I don't have a great sense of, and I'm sure this changed over the years, but the degree to which she had the freedom to make the work she wanted, to invite people into that space as a sort of a quasi-public space. To what degree was she able to function without strictures?
So she was able to make work in that meaning that she did not get into the prison, she was not strictly controlled, but at the same time she was allowed to make it until the very point she is not critical of the regime. And directly she was not. Of course, if we go behind the surface, we can find a lot of comment on the regime. And this is one thing. And the other thing, I do believe that the so-called official art was for painters, huge painters, great artists, and she had never had any affinity towards paintings, which was also a kind of hidden, or a kind of hidden detachment from the official. So she could deal with paper, who cares about it kind of stuff. So it did not bother the official, but at the same time, the whole atmosphere was strictly controlled. So she could invite guests, but not, for example, in, let's say, in Hungary, that you could have so-called apartment exhibitions or apartment performances. Those performances made by her or made by Grigorescu, the guy with whom they worked together, it was by themselves, totally by themselves, so not before an audience.
Right. There was this, I read a part of an interview with her where she said, I mean, she was talking even about socializing with other artists, and she said, I didn't have a life of let's see each other, let's go to a restaurant. I had a man, I had a child, and I had a studio. That was it. And so it was extraordinarily private often.
Yes.
I mean, some commerce with other artists, obviously, and intellectual commerce, and then through the magazine, it would seem there was, it almost seems like there was an unusual degree of freedom in her work with that magazine, with the 20th century.
Yes, the working with the magazine was quite extraordinary because, as she put it, it was an editor-in-chief who could very well communicate with the state officials, which was quite important to explaining what they do is perfectly fine, has nothing to do against the state, it follows the regular rules or so on and so forth. So yeah, this was a kind of heaven or a kind of island for work. But at the same time, she also felt the oppression. So within the socialist sphere, within the Eastern Bloc, which was absolutely not homogeneous, I like to emphasize this, every country was totally different, even with terminology, even with socialist realism, even regarding public and private. But Romania was on the extreme side of it. So it was very, very oppressive in every, especially in the Ceausescu era and in the 70s and late 70s and early 80s. So it was a lot of shortage in food and, for example, rolling blackage. So
like blackouts, like power outages?
Yes, rolling blackouts. So it was, and very severe food shortage, and at the same time, a very well organized surveillance system. So it was a forerunner of the surveillance system we witness now, and worked quite well with Securitate. So nobody was aware whether the other person will report about him to the police or not, and what could report. And it is also different from Soviet Union, because in Soviet Union they also had these apartment exhibitions, and if you get through, I lived half a year in Moscow in the Brezhnev time, and if you knew all the passwords and could get into the underground, then you could see some work and meet people. But in Romania, this did not really exist. So the harshest was only Albania, on the scale, I mean.
Right, right. What were you say? Say that again. On the spectrum of that sort of surveillance and oppression.
Yeah, only Albania
right.
was harsher. Yeah.
Right. And Florence, as a contemporary curator, you spent quite a bit of time in Romania for several years, and met Geta and went to her studio. When was that? Is it like
in 2006? So I was in Romania between 2005 and 2006 because I had been invited to co-curate a biennial in Iași, in the Moldovan part of Romania, which is the northeast part, northern eastern part of Romania. It's a very big university city, and that's when I met quite a lot of artists, curators, art historians, and so on. But that was very specifically during those years, so pretty early on, somehow. And the people I met, they were either my age or younger. So we had all grown up pretty much in the same world. That's how we felt. So the conversations were kind of very open and fluid, and there was no division between East and West. And in our everyday conversations and interactions, which retrospectively is quite strange, but I think there was this very important moment, which was this exhibition after the war, that was, I think, organized in 1999 or 2000. 1999. Yeah, 99. Edith Diouf wrote one of the essays of the catalogue. That moment was really a shifting moment, when all of a sudden there was a bit of time and people were reflecting on the West and the East, or at least within Europe. And I don't know what I was going to say about this, but that's, for me, my experience is very specific because it's generational. Usually we meet people from different generations. I did not when I was in Romania, except for my interaction with Geta. So I had artist friends in Bucharest who brought me to our studio, who told me, you need to meet her. There are two major artists, Ion Grigorescu and Geta Brtescu, you need to know them. I never met Ion, but obviously they were very close. They were friends, they were working together. He actually shot the films that are presented here in the exhibition and most of the films that she produced.
And to what degree at that point, several years ago, were European curators, French curators, aware of her work? Like, I mean, as an American, I'm trying to figure out to what degree was she already known in Europe, especially among contemporary curators?
In 2006, I found a book she dedicated, so I know it was October 2006. I know that I was one of the very rare Western curators who had been to her studio. She, as a matter of fact, her work was presented, I think, really for the first time as a retrospective exhibition at the big National Museum in Bucharest itself in 1999. The show was curated by Roxandra Balut. Thank you. My Romanian accent is really not that good. Balaci, yeah, I would say. And so that's 1999, and it's very, very, I mean, late, obviously, compared to her career. But I went to her studio in 2006, and it was really the beginning of Western curators really getting to know her work, I believe. Yeah. But Edith, you know better, I'm sure.
Yeah, about
the timing.
When did her work start to become better known in the West?
Yeah, I believe this is correct. So after the war was the first and actually the last exhibition, which represented from the Eastern point of view the region, because before that the socialist countries were shown as the East Bloc, and this was the last one, and afterwards only the New Museum exhibition was a regional scope. And there Geta was exhibited heavily, extensively, and also the gender check exhibition, which was in Mumok, Vienna, and dealt with the gender issues in the socialist context.
But more recently there was a show at the Centre Pompidou.
Yes.
It was curated by someone from Ljubljana and someone from Warsaw. Right?
Yep.
And that the earlier show you were talking about was the Nostalgia show that was at the New Museum, right? That was maybe 4 or 5 years ago.
Yes, yes.
So we're speaking about, especially in the States, we're speaking about incredibly recently. But in Europe was after '89, after Ceausescu, was there a gradual process of discovery of people beginning to seek her out, or did it take a a long time.
So
through the 90s
it seems to me that
knowledge.
she was known. For the professionals, she definitely was known. And people, for example, if visited Romania from Hungary, from Poland, they did know about Geta and about Geta's work. So Anna Lupas and Grigorescu was also, but the main breakthrough was when the West started to discover then and treat in the same level as the Western artists. So that was the big breakthrough.
And I haven't read a whole lot, but when that began to happen, what was her feeling about, I mean, she's already in her 80s, and so, I mean, I would assume that there might be a part of her that would think, this is, you know, it's a dubious reward or something, you know, to have that, finally have that recognition from the West. I don't know how she would feel about that.
So actually it seems to me that she was very natural about it. Very natural. So she was absolutely not eager to be successful, but she was pleased and was very glad about. But she was so obsessed about her work that it was not a main concern. And it was a little bit more difficult with Ion Grigorescu because in a way his studio was swept out. So now he doesn't even have a single work. So it happened.
It was swept out how? But
so that he was discovered by the collectors, and it happened in a very short time. So he could, it seems to me it is very subjective if we are speaking about it, but it was more difficult for him to handle it. For Geta, it was just very natural, and she continued to work with her paperworks, and it is, for example, more difficult for those as Grigorescu, who mostly made performances in her studio, filming it, and very strongly connects to that specific milieu to work afterwards, because when the political situation changes and your work connects very strictly to that regime and this collapses overnight, you cannot continue that. So it seems to me that he had a huge exhibition at the Romanian Pavilion in Venice Biennial as well. It was a huge retrospective. And afterwards, it seems to me that she's looking for her voice in a post-socialist era. Mm-hmm. And for Geta, she just continues because she had so many ideas, so many genres, so many unfulfilled tasks. So in the age of 91, she is still full of plans.
I would like to go back again and talk about the focus on the studio, which you talked about a little bit before. And you know, I think about, I mean, there were a lot of artists, particularly in the late 60s, who made the studio a sort of a locus of work and inquiry, made it the conceptual focus of what they were doing. And I think of Bruce Nauman, and you think even up to recently with mapping the studio, where he talks about, like, I think he talks about it almost like a mathematician, where he says, if I'm an artist and I'm in the studio, then necessarily what I'm making in the studio is art, or what I'm doing in the studio is art. But it seems like he had the freedom as an American in those years to make that decision, whereas it seems like Geta probably, that part of that decision was made for her. And anyway, it seemed like it was, you were sort of talking about how she used that is one of the more interesting parts of her work.
So I do think that there is there are similarities, of course, but huge differences between using the studio in the socialist context and Western context, because, as you already mentioned, she simply did not have other possibility. So the public space, in a wider meaning of the word, was not available for people. So everything which you can find in a free world outside, she had to find inside. This is one side of it. So to keep someone mentally healthy had to have this very strong focus. So it was, as I like to put it, a compensation, a substitute for everything which was missing. So, and this was not the case for those Western artists who, when they were bored, they just went out and had a wonderful light outside. So this was mandatory. There was no other possibility. And I can tell another example that for example, people behind the Iron Curtain, especially in Romania, they spoke a lot of languages wonderfully because they spent the time to learn languages. In a very same way that it was a kind of substitute compensation for something which is missing, and which I do find very important, and that is why it was very important for us to make a differentiation between the Western notion of public and the Western notion of private, because if there is this special circumstances, then the artist had to find some agency. And for me, this creative agency is the most peculiar. So it's so very powerful that although Geta was apolitical, and most of the Romanian artists were apolitical because they wanted to survive and they wanted to work. It was not the case in Hungary, for example, or in Russia. But they could still subvert and think about the public. For example, when she blurs the boundaries between subject and object and between outside and inside, this is a kind of symbolical subversion of the rigid regime. So even though explicitly not political, we can find a lot of very, very subtle elements of these subversive gestures.
And when you went to her studio, you spoke in French, and maybe you should just talk a little bit about it, if you could, about what her studio was like at that point, and about how she received young curators, and talk to them about her work.
I mean, to go back to what Edith was saying, it's my memory is that there was this older lady, much older lady, who was so cool and relaxed and open, and she spoke French basically like me, no accent. And her whole generation, up to the generation slightly before me, everyone in Romania speaks French perfectly. So the connection between my country of origin and Romania were extremely strong. I remember growing up with what you were saying, Edith, about Romania. It's very vivid in my memory because we were constantly watching the news. So of course I was born in '73, so the '80s was the worst moment in history, I mean, in modern history in Romania, because the country was entirely locked up. No one was able to leave, no one was able to come in. And I remember this very well because for maybe biographical reasons, I remember the Cold War. Unlike people in my generation, I really remember the Cold War very well. My father was in the military. It was pretty crazy to see a country that closed culturally and so enclosed. So anyway, to go back to happier times, when I visited Geta, yeah, so I was able, it's true, to engage with her simply because she spoke my language fluently. I don't speak Romanian. And, but she was very relaxed. She was just a little surprised because things were happening. I remember this big show she had in the Ceausescu's palace was huge, a huge exhibition, and she had a lot of support from the Romanian art scene, which was beginning to really unite and work together or not. It's a complicated context, but it was very natural, and she gave me her books, even though most of them were in Romanian. And we spoke about, she showed me drawings she was making, because drawing is also really a language, truly. it's yeah, it's something. The seriality of her work is also found in drawings. And I remember her showing me drawings.
Can we stop here?
Oh yeah, that's our favorite work. We discovered, both of us think this is the best work Geta Brtescu ever made. It's also a drawing somehow. It's a project. So
this is the magnet piece. Right?
Edith, you speak beautifully about this.
No, I thought that.
Yeah, maybe we should actually, because this is a work that you can see documentation of upstairs, and I know it's one that you feel. I mean, you talk about her work not being political, but in a sense, this one tiptoes right up to.
Already, it's over. We do not have it anymore.
Let's see, we can try to pause it and go back.
Yeah. So
maybe start off just by explaining a bit for people who haven't seen it what this work, this proposal for these magnets consisted of.
Yes, if you don't mind, I would go a little bit back in time in history just to give an atmosphere about it. That after the October Revolution in Russia, and now there is the centenarium, Lenin figured out the idea of monumental propaganda in 1918, and this was his first actually decree. And this was about that Moscow has to be a kind of Nordic city of sun, as Campanella imagined, which means that an outdoor museum with lots of statues all around. So it was a huge project in Moscow, and they started very quickly put statues all around. So it had a very strong educational purpose to put all the forerunners of the revolution, the heroes of culture, so on and so forth. And now I will leap a bit, and after the region was dominated by the Soviets, this monumental propaganda had to be followed in every city. So all the public spheres in socialist countries were populated by Marx, Engels, lots of Lenins, and not Stalin, but lots of Lenins. So that was the public space. And how did it look like? The public statues, they were monumental, they were huge
and male.
Male, definitely male. Yes, yes,
and
yes.
not so good, most of them.
And actually the model which was in front of Lenin was the French statue mania in the 19th century, but he wanted to use those for socialist end. So, and this was the public space, and huge, static, for eternality, from heavy and long-lasting material. But Geta suggested to the public space, which looked like, as we described, something which is not big at all, something which is not static, because it will constantly change, because this is magnet. So if you get close, all your stuff, your metal stuff, would be sucked by the magnet.
It like depossesses you.
Absolutely.
Depossessions you, I guess, would be the word.
Yes, yeah. yes, depossession, yes. And also this means that constantly changing, so this is a forerunner for process art. And at the same time, I like to put it in this way, that it is a participatory artwork. So a very early participatory artwork, because you are part of it if your, let's say, your watch would be depossessed. And also at the very same time that it has ambiguity. And this is also something which artists from the region like to deal with. So the message is not direct. One reading is that this could be understood as very frightening stuff, because it symbolically tells about that the power is irresistible. You simply cannot do a thing. You will have an impact. But the other side is that very playful, very funny, and the woman.
And the proposal was that large magnets, like powerful magnets, would be placed like outside the city, and then there would be smaller magnets within the city.
Yes, yes.
Right.
So it would be in the very same way as I told that Lenin populated earlier the city. Now let's these magnets populate the public space.
And they're surrounded by a magnetic field that can't be seen, but that can be...
Absolutely,
that
yes.
exerts a power over you.
So it is a kind of interrogation, and once again, this huge and deep wish to participate in a public space where they are excluded and interrupt. And you can imagine that even the transportation could be affected. So it could cause a lot of disturbance in the traffic.
Did you have something to add about that work? I know it was one that the two of you were talking about a lot before we came up here.
No, absolutely. I think this work is so contemporary. I mean, this work hasn't aged at all, and that's really pretty remarkable. What I also find remarkable about this work is how much it is rooted in a Romanian tradition, a literary tradition. And what's important to understand is that Geta, pretty early on in her life, was really surrounded, maybe not by so many artists, but by writers. She went to school with some of the most amazing Romanian writers. And we can see also this in this work, the approach of the studio or the city as a stage, a theater stage, where pretty surrealistic slash UNESCO, I don't know if we can say that, but UNESCO and ish action can take place, and that's what I really find particularly interesting. She's really englobing layers and layers of a culture, and coming from, you were mentioning Greek mythology to really a literary Romanian-rooted tradition. But as a woman working from the studio, taking on the city this way, engaging everyone, and really creating this really strange moment of losing your thoughts and objects and everything in the middle of the non-public public space is pretty remarkable as an action that cannot take place but could take place in the imagination. And that's what I find amazing about Geta Brtescu's work. It's really the way she brings forward the necessity to self-express oneself. And this is really going against all totalitarianism. That's what she really brings forward, really.
One more thing came into my mind, that forerunner, even on that meaning, that this the notion of counter-monument was just discovered recently and used by James Young here. And it is also a counter-monument.
It's also, say again?
A counter-monument,
right,
or anti-monument.
Right.
So in a lot of meaning, it is forerunner of a lot of contemporary ideas in one work.
There was, speaking to what you were talking about her, maintaining her, not only her sanity and her sense of self, but a sort of sphere around her by defining herself as an artist. There was this interview where she said, my life is the experience of a woman who left the comfortable bourgeois home of her parents in her early youth and made her way in life by herself with good and bad. And despite all the ups and downs, something remains constant: the artist vocation and then the awareness of it. It is this awareness of being an artist that removes the tyranny of prejudices. And so it seems like it was, it was her defining herself constantly as an artist, even if she wasn't able to be one in the sense that a lot of other artists could, that not only kept her going, but then defined her work. I mean, like, created the contours for the work.
Well, we can't imagine this, but I mean, we can try. Imagine that you're going to art school, but then after a couple of years, you're kicked out from art school because your parents happen to be pharmacists, and then they are considered bourgeois, and then as a bourgeois daughter of these people, you cannot stay in school, so you need to be sent to do other things. You go to the field, or you're sent to do some agricultural activities, and it's pretty cruel, but that's what happened to her. I mean, she was lucky she was in Bucharest, she was not in the middle of the countryside, But this is something that defined her, obviously. The way the quotation you just told us, really, to me, has to be read through her biography. That's what happened to her. She was discarded from society because of her parents' social status or economic status. It happened to many, many, many people. But then she was also, we didn't tell this, but there was this, I think it's really important to understand, correct me if I'm wrong, but Romania is that there was this super powerful artist union, and they were organizing everything. They were giving artist studios, they were organizing shows, they were organizing trips abroad before the 80s. And she benefited from this. She traveled quite a lot.
She talks about traveling, like she said she wasn't a tourist, she traveled almost as an academic, or she thought of herself as an academic, but she traveled widely. And because through these programs, I guess.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And this is a good point to mention, because this is also a huge difference from the other socialist countries, because in Hungary, for example, in Poland, especially in Russia, existed a kind of counter-movement or oppositional movement, named differently. In Russia, it is non-conformist art. In Hungary, underground oppositional art. But in Romania, and especially Romanian art historians emphasize this strongly, that we cannot use this notion of oppositional art in a strict meaning of the word, because as you explained, everybody was member of this union, because you simply could not exist outside of it. So, and in this meaning, political oppositional art did not exist. That is why these very subtle comments on things and the existence behind the Iron Curtain was so very important. And when Geta, and get back once again to the studio, when she shows us this very, very suffocating and very claustrophobic studio, and it is not just the concrete physical space, but the feeling, it truly comes through. So you cannot breathe normally either, because it is so very suffocating. And even when she measures the coordinates of her size, shows us that this is your coordinates, you can move within this, and what you can get out of this. So these very subtle, subversive moments are the most important for me in her art. And not to use and not to find direct political connotations, but for example, that kind that is true that she was member of the union, but she never painted, because paintings was something which belonged to the official art. Painting belonged to mere serious artists. So she dealt with paper, this very fragile material, used materials, and...
Through the union, do you think she was ever pressed to paint? You know, that there was that they wanted her to paint and she resisted that, or it didn't matter?
So actually, this is a good question. If you will make an interview with her, definitely ask her, because it would be good to know. But generally in the interview, she tells that she did not have any affinity towards painting, but if she would, that could have been a problem. So because then she should have painted official kind of socialist realism. Yeah. So, but to deal with paper, it was not taken seriously. So, and this was a very good thing to hide behind.
Right, and that was a political subterfuge on her part, to a degree, or do you think it was just that it was a happy coincidence that she didn't really want to do what was officially sanctioned?
Probably unconsciously, she wanted to survive and she wanted to deal with her art.
Yeah, no, I would say it was really a strategy, because the union was very clear. They had thematics, you had to paint, and you had to paint birds or people, and literally it was very, very, very clear for everybody. And then if you were not participating, she probably played dumb a little bit, drawing in her studio, but she saved herself. Ion Gregorescu, as you mentioned, I mean, he has a different personality, he was very tortured and lost his friends and didn't cope with in the same way, but probably the fact that he was in the studio the same way didn't have the same impact on him as a woman, she says. I mean, I had a child, I had a husband, I had things to do as a woman, but for him it was very difficult, and he was also involved politically, which put a lot of risk on him and on his work. He had to bury some of his films. That's the reason why they were destroyed, or partly destroyed. Different biography. But if we leave Bucharest and we talk about other parts of Romania, let's say Timișoara, when there was the Sigma group and what was his name, Stefan Bertolan. Well, important figures, they had a very different approach. I mean, also in Cluj, what was her name, Anna? Lupaș, very different approach as well. They were really focusing on nature, they were working outside. It's a very, very different history as well, or story, right?
So maybe unconsciously, but very cleverly decided to do that.
Right. Something that's, probably pretty relevant right now is her views about feminism. And I mean, you had mentioned this a little bit earlier, but she was, she was, in interviews, she talks about her opposition to what she considered orthodox first wave feminism. And in reading those, it always seems like she's not completely being straightforward in how that her opposition wasn't total. I mean, but she said feminism means a uniform, and it is part of a political maneuver where women become objects. It's another part of the political maneuver where women become objects. And then she says femininity and not feminism. Femininity operates using self-knowledge and distancing. Femininity is a specific energy. It's an aura, a light that is a gift and which entices the world through diversity. And I thought, I mean, you've written quite a bit about this, and I thought maybe you could talk about how her approach and the approach of other women in the Eastern Bloc or in Romania in first wave feminism, as they were becoming aware of that movement.
Yes. So first, I would tell that there is a huge irritation in the region, and not just in Romania, but in other countries as well, towards feminism. So it is so very strong that sometimes the person are puzzled. How come that still such an opposition against feminism? And one reason is that that it was a forced collectivism. This was the main slogan, to be collective, collectivism. So individualism was so precious, so very precious. So someone didn't want to be involved in another collective movement. This is one thing, I believe. The other thing is that ideology was also so abused that nobody wants to have another ideology, and it seems very ideological. And the second one, this military tone, was also something which it was a gut feeling to get as far as it is possible. So this is the one side of an explanation of this opposition, as I told you, till now. So for example, it's amazing that Hungary especially, but in Romania, is so very macho, still today. So there is this remnant of this socialist opposition. But concerning Geta, I do believe that without this ideological collectivist sisterhood notion, she has a lot of similarity with the first wave feminism, that using a lot of things which was regarded as female and second rate, she used with a great pleasure. This is, for example, seriality. Seriality is very, very important, something which is as opposition of painting, one finished perfect and nothing to do, to put to it. Variation and seriality is totally opposing the male-dominated painting. And also the using of the material. She used almost waste material. For example, we can see some wonderful work upstairs, one which is Schwitters-like collages from guard-drop tickets. So anyone who traveled, guard-drop tickets, right, traveled in socialism that time, very familiar that with that object. And also, she is using, for example, smoked cigarette remnants, and which has a history. There is human behind. So her use of object is totally different. As for example, this heroic male pop art artist, or so her ready-made is almost a waste. So she would like to use everything which is around.
And I think I had mentioned this earlier, but she talked about drawing with a sewing machine as, in an interview, I mean, she was searching for the right word, and it was in French, but she called it a sport. And it was because trying to create the forms that she wanted to create with fabric on a sewing machine was put all these impediments in front of her. It was incredibly difficult. And so she flipped that whole, you know, this notion of sewing as women's work, and you know, for herself as a draftswoman, she flipped that whole notion. She flipped it on its head. One. Right.
Yes, absolutely. So used it with absolutely proudly used it, but at the same time didn't make a big deal about it. So like the Spartan movement in Los Angeles, this Shapiro and. Right. They emphasized very strongly. She used it very naturally.
The pattern and decoration movement.
Yes, pattern and decoration, exactly. But in a way, I could connect her to this movement, but not as a conceptual and theoretical connection, but a very natural one. And also the same with this great goddess movement. She also, I have a lot of feeling of similarities with that too. And also on Amandieta, as she used her body and the soil. We can see a video at the exhibition, which very similar to Anna Mandieta's use of the soil and her body and mask. And
do either of you have a sense of, through her work with the magazine, 20th Century, and then her traveling on these sort of official trips, what interchanges or meetings did she have with her contemporaries elsewhere? And what from the interviews, I get zero sense of which artists she knew about through her work in the magazine, or which artists she met or saw the work of. And so it's hard to figure out intellectually how isolated she was. Or who her influences were outside of Romania.
Yes, it's a quite difficult question. In Hungary, for example, some library could get very good catalogs. So they at least had catalogs. We probably have to check it out, what was the case in Romania. I do believe that this editorial house could have some information. But I do not believe she was aware in a deep meaning what is happening outside on the field. And concerning the Poland visit, it is well known that she met Tadeusz Kantor and even was influenced by him. But we do know that she was in Hungary, and there is no knowledge about whom she met. So I actually also forget to ask. We have to make some research whether she met someone or not. But from the diaries, she was so very happy to get outside of the country and to see simply works in Venice and elsewhere. So she kind of ate everything. So was not vegetarian or meat eater.
She kind of ate everything.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I know I've seen images of her travel journals, which are these large books where, you know, they're almost touristic, but they're you know, gluing in all these images and I mean, she took those trips seriously from a documentarian purpose and documented everything she saw. Mostly older art, you know, Renaissance and medieval art and all that.
So actually what you are asking, it is the task of the further research, because the research until recently focused on her own oeuvre. And the analogies were mostly kind of superficial about the coincidences, but the actual readings, actual contemporary impacts, it is still to be researched, I believe.
Although outside, again, to go back to Ion Grigorescu, he was perfectly aware. He was really receiving magazines, reading magazines, really aware of what was going on outside of Romania. There's an example, the piece he made called The Kitchen in '76. That's 1 year after Martha Rosler's Symbiotics of the Kitchen, and he made a work in his own house/studio, you know, doing exactly everything that everyone does on an everyday basis, but showing it as a very important artwork. I mean, obviously he knew Martha Rosler's work, and he knew about a lot of things. Given the fact that they were very close, we can assume that she also knew what was going on pretty much at the time outside of the country, no? Don't you think?
So it is also possible that she knew quite a lot from Grigorescu himself. This is just possible. But definitely we cannot imagine in the same way as now we are gathering knowledge from the world. So it was kind of accidental.
People, you know, draw parallels between her and Louise Bourgeois a lot. But do you have a sense of whether she had any awareness of Bourgeois' work when she was like in the 70s, 80s, 90s?
In the 70s, 80s, no.
No.
I can imagine that afterwards, in the 90s, yes, she could. But I don't believe, we have to check it and ask her, but I don't believe in 70s, 80s. Actually, Hungary was a little bit more open, and some libraries could buy books and catalogs, and those artists were not aware of, for example, Louise Bourgeois. Or
it's funny because we were talking about the magnets, and that work always makes me think about what was happening in Europe, or not only in Europe, but here and in Europe in the 90s with that generation of Pierre Huyghe, Pareno, Philippe Pareno, and Rikri Teravanija, and so on, who were really reconsidering the exhibition, but also through the injection of fiction through reality. Or Francis Alice talking, what we need is fables. And when we look at Geta Brtescu, it's amazing to think that because of everything we discussed, the political context of Romania and so on, the fact that fables, and that's why the show is called Aesop. I mean, this is really, Aesop is the influence on Jean de La Fontaine and so many other who, under very complex political, rather totalitarian periods, had to, in order to deliver their message, had to really use this trick of the fables. But that's what she does too. She's using the trick of the fable regularly in her work. And that's the reference to Médée, the reference to Aesop, and so on, is very, very present. The magnet is a fable, a modern fable. And then when I see, again, this work, and I talk about this with you, I really have this, this idea to connect it more to a much younger generation of artists, in a way.
Well, you've written a bit about her use of fables and why she was drawn to those. And what's your thinking about her attraction to? I mean, she's talked a bit about Medea and this idea of the mother killing the children and how that relates to her thoughts about motherhood as a sort of a central part of her work too.
Yes, so first I believe you already mentioned that she has double education, also literature and art. So she was very well educated in classical and ancient literature. And so this is one thing. The other thing is that somehow to be connected to the literature and illustrate it was absolutely legal or canonized. So this is another thing. And a lot of artists had that kind of civil job. For example, Kabakov, Ilya Kabakov, a lot of Hungarian, Slovakian artists. So this illustration was a very natural and very kind of, in a social meaning, very useful job. So it was evaluated because this is what an artist has to do. So Aesop, there is a lot of written about that Aesop was everything for her, a metaphor and as an alter ego. It seems to me that it was a very useful shield or mask as well, behind which one could speak freely, because that is the medium. He speaks, it is not me. So
right. He was malleable. You could use him for a lot of different purposes. Exactly,
exactly. And if you would see the exhibitions, she absolutely does not follow the plot. So no illustration. So if you would like, my son, for example, is absolutely a fan of Aesop, knows everything about all the fables he uses when there is a problem. And I just wanted to find one of the fables. You cannot find it, because there is no connection to the fables. So for him, it was much more important, the figure itself. And somewhere I read, and I liked it very much, this citation, that I do believe, tells Geta, that he was an ugly but very charmer man. Mm-hmm. And so she had a kind of personal relationship with him, and used through which she can speak. And if you would check, so not just that you cannot find the plot, you cannot, it is not illustration in the strict meaning of the word, you cannot find animals. All those fables is told through animals, but you cannot find them. Just people. And what she opposes in the video, it is a powerless layman, a very modest layman who would like to do good things, and there is this powerful guy who makes the bad stuff. But at the very end, this small and layman is the one who wins, even wins over the death. So this is a kind of imaginary projection into these figures, also something which was missing. So she wanted to find kind of justice. I do not want to say big words, but still, this was a hunger towards to find some justice. So imagination gave this satisfaction. So that is why I like very much to deal with this kind of artistic agency as an imaginary transgressions.
Right. Well, she, on that point, she talked about Medea being, you know, it was this sanctioned way, because it was literary, but it was this sanctioned way to give her this agency to explore something else. What she said that Medea was about sinning in thought. It happens to me countless times every day. I think in the majority of women, the demon of the libido and the demon of death are at work. And this was a way for her to explore that in a way that felt very mythical and literary, but she was doing exactly what she wanted to do through that vehicle.
Absolutely. Perfectly done.
So, do you think that we should open the floor to questions now? Do we? I think we've covered what we were wanting to talk about.
So if we did not, it will be asked, right?
Yeah, exactly. And we can pass around a microphone if we can't hear anybody, although it's a small room. Yes. You might need a microphone. You're in the back.
So whether they meet or not?
Yes, I think.
Who, another question, if you interview her, which should be asked.
We need to be making a list here.
They do know about each other. I'm absolutely positive. And I totally agree with you, because I just told Florence that Dóra Mauer is the Hungarian Geta.
I said it in opposite way, but yes.
So, or yeah, you can say it in an opposite way. So they are very similar, and even in the way they use the studio, still there are differences also. That, for example, as Geta uses this very subtle subversion and comments on the political system, this lack of institutions and lack of public space in Dóra Maurer's work appears in this way, that she makes very concrete comment on political event. For example, she made a private May 1st march in the studio. So she didn't went to the official, it was mandatory to go to this May 1st march, but she made a private march in the studio. So this is another kind of subversion. If we do not have the public space, okay, I will make from my public space from my private space a public space. But yeah, I absolutely do agree. We were speaking about that they are very similar, so I absolutely agree with you. And I do not know, I will ask Dóra, and you will ask Geta.
Right.
Your comment about kind of using Aesop as this tool for having a nuanced approach to maybe a more political voice. I know that there's the piece where she depicts Ionesco, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, but Ionesco as a clown, and I know that he has both French and Romanian heritage. So I was just wondering, in lieu of kind of thinking about Aesop as a vehicle for a conversation, what her aim might have been for embodying him as another kind of figure of play.
Ionesco, you mean?
Ionesco.
It's very interesting, if I may, to say a personal comment. I read everything about Geta which is available. I know very well Magda. She was not my student, but we had a kind of close relationship. And I told Magda, there is just one thing which puzzles me. This is Ionesco. Tell me about this. And then she was in Warsaw, so she did not reply. So I thought, oh my God, if this one question will be raised, I will be in trouble. But I was thinking about, and I do think that she put into the center of this Ionesco. Actually, she had a nickname. He had a nickname that a clown. It was his nickname, and I checked it out that he wrote a piece with the title The Clown, and as Florence told, she made this absurd drama. So the absurd and the clown and the literary and the art comes together in this portrait. And also could be served as, yes, you are right, I can agree with you, that could serve in the same way as Aesop. So that kind of hiding behind her, that I make also an absurd theater, and but it's funny that it was raised. I will tell her that, you see, you did not reply.
Okay, I think if there are no other questions, I would like to thank Florence and Edith. It was a great pleasure for me to hear this, and thanks for coming.